podcast where mental health meets real life. I'm your host, Samantha Ariza, therapist, educator, mom, speaker, semi-normal human being, depends on who you talk to, but I want to be your go-to person for real, relatable conversations about healing, growth, and this whole emotional wellness thing we talk about. Around here, we want to believe and we want you to understand that mental health doesn't have to be stiff or scary or way too serious at times. We want to keep it human, practical, and have a little bit of fun along the way because you know what? Life's messy and too serious, and we're all just trying to figure it out. Each week, I'm going to give you honest insights, science backed tools, and stories that remind you you're not alone. Whether you're on your own journey of mental health or supporting someone else's or just diving into a little bit more of what this means, there's something here for you. So grab a tea, grab a coffee, your favorite blanket or sweater, and just get cozy with me for a while because we're going to dive into this today. Because have you ever said to yourself, I'm just overwhelmed? Or even like, I'm stressed or I'm anxious? But something about that label did not quite fit. And because underneath we see that the word needs something else. That word isn't enough. The feeling is heavier, needs something more specific to describe it. And a lot of times it's not just overwhelm. Maybe it's not disappointment. Maybe it's something like shame or grief or even something more specific. So today we're going to talk about emotional vocabulary. And what happens when we label or mislabel these feelings? What does that do for us? Because the words we use when it comes to emotion is super important. And I don't think we understand that as much. When I talk to clients a lot about emotions and what they're feeling, it is something that is kind of like pulling teeth at times because we don't understand that being able to describe our emotions and our experience is more than just that. These words that we use shape how our brains understand and respond, and even how we recover from it. So, if you tend to feel emotions intensely, or even just want to understand your emotions a little bit more, this is for you. We're going to cover these topics today: emotional vocabulary and why that matters, emotional granularity, which is the science of precision in language. We're going to discuss how mislabeling emotions actually increases that intensity. We're going to look at a study that was about affect labeling and the brain. This is the Leiberman study, and we're going to go into what they discovered. Next, we're going to cover why intense feelings and intense feelers struggle more with this labeling, how shame, learning, and safe emotion labels are something that we're taught, and how culture kind of gives us this emotional language and kind of rules on how we talk about emotions. Lastly, we're going to dive into practical tools and how to build that emotional vocabulary because emotional vocabulary matters. Most of us were never taught how to identify emotions with precision. Let's be real, a lot of times culturally, we're not even taught the nuance in emotion. We are taught the basics: sad, mad, happy, scared, right? When I do my presentations at schools, I have a feelings wheel, and in the middle of them are these feelings. And I'm like, these are the basic ones that we learn. And it's true. A little bit of nuance that we get later on is this idea of stressed or anxious, but for the most part, we're either sad, mad, happy, or scared. But emotions are not like basic colors. They're more like they're shades of things. There are more words than we really realize. And psychological research shows that emotions differ along multiple different dimensions. We go with meaning, we go with action tendencies, how aroused emotionally we are, and how intense they can be. When we lump them all together under these broad labels, it may feel efficient, But it comes at a cost. And I don't think we realize what that cost is because the brain regulates emotions based on that meaning. And vague meaning leads to vague regulation. In psychology, there's a concept called emotional granularity. This is what we call the science of naming emotions precisely. We want to be able to identify and describe these emotions very specifically because there are so many differences. When we talk about like anger or being mad, there's so many different levels of it. We have irritation, we have frustration, we have resentment, we have rage. These are all more specific than when we are saying mad or angry. There is a researcher, Lisa Feldman Barrett, and others who have consistently found that with higher emotional granularity, we see that people are able to regulate their emotions more effectively. This leads to them recovering from distress more quickly, and they have lower rates of anxiety and depression because they're able to adapt different coping skills and actually use a more effective and precise coping strategy because they are able to name the emotion precisely. And that means that their emotions are less overwhelming. Why do we see that? It's because precise labeling helps the brain predict more accurately what it's doing and what it can do next. So when you name it, your nervous system doesn't have to guess what to do. Now, we see that mislabeling emotions can increase that intensity and not that clarity that we're looking for. For example, we see that labeling grief as anxiety or labeling shame as anger, labeling disappointment as stress, labeling hurt as irritability. This means that the brain is going to select the wrong regulation strategy. If we think we're anxious, we might try to do a deep breathing. But if we're not actually anxious and we're actually dealing with grief, deep breathing is not going to help us feel any better. If we're dealing with shame and we're trying to count to because we said it's anger, that's not going to do anything for us. So when we are mislabeling these emotions, we're unable to figure out what we need to do in order to feel better. So, this mismatch, again, can create prolonged emotional activation. It leads to frustration, and we start to think that there is something wrong with us. And then that leads to the idea that why am I going to go to therapy? Why am I going to talk to someone? Because you know what? They don't know what they're talking about. We get this sense that nothing works, and then our bodies feel more escalated instead of feeling that relief. But the thing is, the emotion isn't wrong. That feeling isn't wrong. We just haven't been able to direct the right skills to that emotion. So it's not that the emotion is wrong. It's not the feeling. It's not what's going on in our bodies. It's just we are not able to figure out what really is going to work. Because at the end of the day, the brain literally changes when you name the emotion. We're going to get into research about how this affect labeling can really help us feel better. And this is where we talk about the Leiberman study. Lieberman saw that simply naming an emotion reduced emotional reactivity more effectively than distraction. So, what were the researchers doing? The researchers wanted to know, does simply labeling an emotional experience change that brain activity? Even if you're not trying to calm down. Because a lot of times when we did research about how the brain reacts when we're actively trying to feel better. But what if we're not just actively trying? What if we're just trying to name it? They were especially interested in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. If you remember from episode 301, we talked about how the amygdala is that emotional reactivity center. That's that fight, flight, or freeze. And that prefrontal cortex is where regulation and emotion making meaning is going to happen. So at the time, most emotion regulation research focused on active strategies, like I said, but we weren't going to do that here. So what did we do? Participants were placed in an fMRI scanner and shown emotionally evocative images, meaning this was something that was going to make them feel something. Primarily, they were looking at faces expressing strong emotions like fear or anger. So they were required to complete different tasks while viewing the same emotional stimuli. One group had this affect labeling condition. Participants had to choose which emotion word worked best for the image. This required them to recognize the emotion, to assign a label, but they're not trying to regulate or change it. The second group was the control conditions. These participants either had to match the face based on physical features like gender or like different other describers that they had, or passively view the image. Importantly to note, the emotional stimulus stayed the same, but only the task changed. So they were going through these different groups. One time they had to actively name it. The other one, they had to just passively go through it and talk about like describing the picture. This allowed those researchers to actually isolate the effect of labeling because in the one group, if you're just noticing what's going on in the picture, you're not really trying to deal with your emotions. But in the other one, actively having to identify the emotions, they were able to see the difference between the two. So what did they find? The key findings here, which are interesting, is that the amygdala activity decreased during affect labeling. Remember, the amygdala is that defense system. So its activity is going down while they are just labeling the emotions. The amygdala was significantly reduced compared to passive viewing or non emotional tasks. This means that simply naming an emotion dampened the brain's threats response. They did not deep breathe. They did not do positive thinking. They did not try to reappraise what's going on. They didn't try to calm down. They didn't use any skills. They were just naming the emotion. And when we looked at the prefrontal cortex, we saw that the activity there increased. Specifically, we saw activation in the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which we talked about in episode 301. This was the region involved in language inhibition, meaning making, and regulation of emotional responses. We saw that there was greater prefrontal activation, predicted that there was going to be greater amygdala reduction, which we talked about in episode 301. Again, suggesting that the functional relationship was if we have prefrontal cortex modulation, we are not going to feel the emotion as actively. And this matters because it demonstrates that language in itself is a regulatory tool. Emotional words just don't describe their feelings, they help make them feel better. Again, because it helps the brain organize and contain them. And you don't have to just try to regulate. Regulation is going to happen on its own because this affect labeling worked even without your intent to calm down. And again, naming emotions creates this top down control. Prefrontal regions engage, that limbic amygdala kind of decreases, and this is not suppression. Because when we talk about suppressing your emotions, which is a big thing, I don't know how many times I've seen even like memes on like TikTok or Instagram about like, we don't feel the feelings, we kind of put them in the closet. But what we see with suppression typically increases that physiological stress. We feel more activated as we are trying to suppress and push back those emotions. The study helped explain why emotional vocabulary matters more for the individuals who feel strongly, not less. Because when intensity is high, that brain needs structure. And that the words, those prompts provide that structure that they need. Because when we mislabel, like I'm anxious instead of I'm ashamed, or I'm just sad versus I'm feeling just overwhelmed, we engage the wrong pathways. We have prolonged activation and we fail to calm the nervous system. Precise labeling gives the brain better instructions, and that's what we need. Labeling helps the brain organize experience instead of bracing against it. I might be one of those therapists that you kind of get mad at because when you use the words like happy, sad, or angry, I'm asking you to find a better word, which is why it's so important to have a big emotional vocabulary. But don't worry, you do not have to carry around a thesaurus or keep asking Google what a different word is for the feeling that you're trying to get at. I created a resource on arizainspired.com called the Feelings Wheel. And with this Feelings Wheel, it helps you get to the bottom of what emotion you are feeling. But don't worry, it's not just a wheel with different colors and different words. I do add journal prompts, I do add a different technique, something that can help you on your own get to the bottom of the emotions you are feeling, because you're not alone in figuring out what this emotion thing means. So head over to arizainspired.com and download this free, did I say it was free? Because hey, it's free. This free resource to help you broaden that emotional vocabulary language. If you get anything from season 3, please understand that emotional vocabulary is crucial in order to regulate your emotions, and you don't have to do that on your own. So let's get back to the episode. So if you feel emotions deeply, you might think labeling should be easier, but often the opposite is true. Because when we are feeling emotions so intensely, our attention is flooded. We have narrow cognitive bandwidth, and our amygdala, our threat system is all activated. The thing I think we don't understand a lot is that if we are feeling the feelings and our threat system and that whole fight, flight, or freeze is activated, we can't normally get to that prefrontal. We talked about it a little bit before, but the whole thing is kind of one system overrides the other one. So when we're feeling emotion so intensely, we can't always get where we need to go because our nervous system is pushed into that survival mode. It defaults usually into kind of global categories of emotion: bad, too much, I can't handle this, I'm overwhelmed. And I mean, valid. When emotions are flooding us, we do feel overwhelmed. However, we need to make sure that if we are trying to overcome it, we can't lose access to that emotional vocabulary. And I mean, it's our bodies doing what they do most. So we have to kind of give ourselves a little grace in that moment and not stress ourselves more about not having that emotional vocabulary. Because another important piece here can be shame. Many emotions are implicitly or explicitly discouraged when we're growing up in the system, if you think about it. We think about how, like sadness. Sometimes it's like, why do you feel sad? Why are you not like grateful? I think is another one, especially like the idea of if I am not happy, I'm not being grateful. Even if you do feel sad, it's like, why are you sad? You live in like the great, this is the one thing. It's like, you live in the greatest country in the world. Why are you sad? And it's like, yeah, I'm not in a third world country, but there's still stuff going down, right? So we see that a lot of things are discouraged. Sadness, neediness, being disappointed, feeling jealous or angry. And when an emotion feels unsafe to express, a lot of times we learn to rename it, or we ignore that one or try to like push ourselves into another one. For example, I'm not angry, I'm just stressed out. I'm overwhelmed. I'm frustrated. Frustrated, I feel like, is a little more acceptable than I'm angry. We say, I'm not hurt. I'm just tired. I'm not lonely. I'm just busy. And it's not about being dishonest with yourself. It's about adapting. Because again, who wants to not be accepted? Who wants to have an emotion that's not going to be accepted? Because if we think about it, when we have these emotions that are unacceptable, we risk being kind of like shunned from the group. And as much as we are great at being individuals, nobody wants to be shunned. Over time, we see that chronic mislabeling can disconnect you from what you actually need and what you're actually feeling. And you can't tend to an emotion you don't have the language for. And you can't tend to an emotion that you're not willing to admit that you have. Because emotional vocabulary is learned and it's not innate. It's something we have to kind of discover on our own. But the hopeful part is that you can learn it. Research shows that emotional concepts are constructed through different learning, experience, and language exposure. So you can learn those things. Just expose yourself to more language around emotions. The more precise emotional words you have access to, the more precisely your brain can interpret your signals that your body's sending, predict where your emotions are going, and select the correct regulation strategy, which I think is super important. We can't keep applying the wrong emotion strategies to something that's not happening to us. This means that emotional intelligence is trainable even in adulthood. No matter how old you are, you can learn more about your emotions and learn how to handle them and how to explain them and how to work with them because your emotions are not going anywhere. And this matters deeply for people who feel emotionally intense feelings because precision, again, reduces that overwhelm. So, what's helpful if you feel emotions intensely? And this is my favorite part because here's some practical tools for you. I want you to practice emotion zooming. Instead of asking, what's wrong with me? Ask, if I had to get more specific, what kind of uncomfortable is this? What kind of category am I in? Try narrowing it. Instead of saying stressed, maybe you're pressured or rushed or burdened. Instead of sad, maybe you're disappointed, lonely, or even grieving. And grieving's not specific to the loss of a person. It can be a loss in general. If you've lost an opportunity, lost a job, lost a relationship, you are grieving. Instead of saying anxious, maybe we're saying that I'm uncertain or I am feeling some anticipatory feeling here, or I feel exposed. Maybe instead of angry, we're resentful. Maybe we feel dismissed. Maybe we feel like there has been an injustice against us. And when we specifically find those words, we can calm our nervous system. The next thing that I want you to do that you can help yourself with these emotions is separate that arousal and those body feelings from the emotion. High activation doesn't automatically mean that you're feeling anxiety. So ask, is this high energy plus fear? Because then we're dealing with anxiety. Is this high energy plus injustice? Because maybe then I'm angry. Is this even loss of energy? Let's like, if this loss and low energy plus loss, then this might be grief. Is this low energy plus self judgment? Then maybe I'm feeling shame because low energy can also be signs of depression, but maybe, or sadness, but maybe it's something else. Again, we're looking at how our body is working and trying to figure out what the emotion that may be related, but not all of them are identical. High energy, low energy, there's other facets that we got to look at that is going to help us correctly identify what we're feeling. Let's use language before problem solving. Before we're fixing or planning or explaining, let's work on just labeling first, even silently, even just to ourselves. This is disappointment. This is grief. This is resentment. This is loneliness. This is irritation. When we engage that regulatory brain, it helps us get to that action brain that we need. So we can't force that. I want you to build an emotion vocabulary list. I want you to keep a short list of kind of nuanced emotions, the different shades of those big four that we've talked about. And I want you to revisit it when you're calm. Because when we are calm, guess what? We're working in that prefrontal brain, and that's where we're going to be able to absorb the information better. This isn't overthinking. This is just training your brain for future moments of intensity. This is logging in that information for when we need it. And I want you to remember, again, I think I say this, I've been saying this for a couple different episodes at this point, that intensity doesn't always mean pathology. You're not making a diagnosis based on these intensity. Feeling emotions deeply does not mean that there is something wrong with you. It often means that you're just highly responsive or very meaning oriented or just sensitive to certain contexts. What changes everything is learning the language of your inner experiencing, not judging yourself for it, and also not holding it against you. So, if emotions often feel overwhelming, confusing, or too much, it may not be because you feel too deeply. It may be because your system hasn't been given the precise enough words to manage what's going on. So, when you name it, you are clearly organizing and figuring it out without amplifying them. Organized emotions are easier to write out, to respond to release. So this week, I want you to try this. When something hits hard, pause and ask yourself, what am I actually feeling beyond that first label? Because again, when your emotions feel understood, they don't need to shout at you. But that's it for today's episode. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I hope you found this helpful. If you found it helpful, inspiring, or just validating, please just leave me a message. You can follow the show, you can leave a comment, you can leave a review, and always share it with someone who you think might need it. Do you need some more support as you're going through this mental wellness journey? Head over to arizainspire.com. You'll find more resources there for free. Especially since we're talking about feelings, why don't you go download my feeling wheel? That'll definitely give you more words to express your emotions. And of course, don't forget to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook at Ariza Inspire Co. That's where we keep this conversation going. We share mental health tips. We post about new episodes. And sometimes I'm a little embarrassing. If you look at Christmas, there's this whole Christmas tree thing that I loved, but maybe was a little out there. But my friends, take care of yourself, and I'll catch you next time. Can't wait for next week? Here's a sneak peek of the next episode on the Ariza Inspire podcast. One of the hardest things that people struggle with accepting when you can't feel the emotions is that your body is shutting down to protect you. It's not because you're too weak. It's not because there's something wrong with you. It's because your body knows that this is going to overwhelm you. We've talked about just recently this idea of how trauma plays a part in emotional blunting and shutting down, and that's because your system doesn't want you to be overwhelmed. It shuts down to survive. Because in high stress situations, your brain prioritizes functioning, coping, getting through, not falling apart, because your brain is wired to survive.